The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, my mother's voice cutting through the somber atmosphere of my father's funeral. "You're not family." Three simple words that shattered what little composure I had left on the worst day of my life. But as I sat there, broken and bewildered, the stoic general, a man I barely knew, silently took the seat beside me, his presence speaking volumes in the deafening quiet. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The chill of September wind cut through my army dress uniform as I stepped off the plane in Arlington, Virginia. 17 years of service had taken me to deserts and mountains across the world, but nothing felt as foreign as returning to my hometown. The familiar skyline seemed to watch me with judgment, as if the city itself questioned my right to be there. I drove past Arlington National Cemetery, where rows of pristine white headstones stretched into the distance like silent sentinels. Each marker represented someone who had made the ultimate sacrifice, just as my father had, though not in combat. The monuments and military presence that had once inspired my career choice now felt like accusers, reminding me of everything I'd missed while serving overseas. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted my uniform in the rearview mirror of my rental car. The medals and ribbons that told the story of my deployment suddenly felt heavy, like armor I needed for the battle ahead. I knew I wouldn't be welcomed as a returning hero, but as an outsider who had chosen duty over family. The funeral home stood solemn against the autumn sky. I paused before entering, taking deep breaths to steady myself. Inside, distant relatives and family friends milled about, their conversations falling silent as I entered. Some nodded respectfully at my uniform, while others averted their eyes, clearly aware of the family tension. A cousin I hadn't seen in years approached with an awkward hug. "It's good you could make it," she said, her tone suggesting surprise rather than welcome. Near the entrance, a large display board showed the seating arrangement for tomorrow's service. My eyes scanned the chart once, twice, searching for my name among the immediate family. The front row listed my mother, my brother, aunts, and uncles, but I was nowhere to be found. The realization sent a physical shock through my body, a confirmation of what I'd feared. In my mother's eyes, I had forfeited my place in the family when I enlisted. An usher approached, his expression sympathetic as he noticed my focus on the seating chart. "Are you looking for your name, ma'am?" he asked quietly. I straightened my shoulders, the military bearing returning instinctively. "I was," I replied, forcing steadiness into my voice. "But I think I've found my answer." The absent name on that chart was just the beginning, a small but unmistakable sign of the rejection awaiting me at my own. Father's funeral. Tomorrow, I would face my mother's cold stare and my brother's resentment, armed with nothing but my uniform and the hope that somewhere my father understood why I had chosen to serve. I stood near the entrance of the funeral home, my army uniform crisp despite the long journey back to Arlington. The cold September breeze followed me inside, but it was nothing compared to the chill that ran through me when I saw my mother approaching. Eleanor Thompson moved with purpose through the gathering mourners, her black dress immaculate, her face a mask of composure that only I could read properly. She had spotted me from across the room. Our eyes locked for just a moment before she altered her course, making a deliberate path toward me. The years had etched new lines around her mouth, but the hardness in her gaze remained unchanged, the same look she'd given me 17 years ago when I first announced my enlistment. "You're early," she said, her voice controlled and quiet. Not a greeting, just an observation. "I wanted to pay my respects before everyone arrived," I replied, searching her face for any crack in the facade, any hint of the mother who had once tucked me in at night. Eleanor glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. Then she leaned closer, close enough that I could smell her familiar perfume. the same scent that once meant comfort, but now heralded pain. "You're not family," she whispered, each word precise and cutting. "You gave up that right when you chose the army over us, over him." The words hit me with physical force. I had survived firefights in distant deserts, endured the concussive blast of roadside bombs, carried wounded comrades through hostile territory, but nothing had prepared me for the surgical precision of my mother's rejection. "Mom," I started, but my voice faltered. What could I possibly say? That I had served my country with honor? That I had written letters my father had proudly shown to neighbors? That every deployment had been another form of service to the values he had taught me? She stepped back, adjusting her black shawl with practiced dignity. "The immediate family will be seated in the front. You can find a place in the back." As she walked away, I remained rooted to the spot, feeling the stares of distant relatives who had witnessed our exchange without hearing the words. In that moment, I felt more profoundly alone than during any night watch in foreign territory, more isolated than in any field hospital where I'd lain wounded. My throat tightened as I watched my brother enter with his wife, immediately embraced by our mother. The three of them formed a perfect tableau of family unity, a picture from which I had been deliberately erased. I found my place in the last row of Arlington's Memorial Chapel, the polished wood of the pew cold beneath my hands. Despite being the eldest child, my assigned seat was at the very back of the gathering, a physical manifestation of my mother's declaration that I wasn't family. The uniform I wore with such pride now felt like a target on my back, marking me as the outsider. From this vantage point, I could see everyone. Cousins I hadn't seen in years occupied the middle rows, their heads bowed in practiced solemnity. Neighbors who had watched me grow up sat closer to the front than I did. Even distant relatives, people whose names I could barely recall, had been granted positions of honor that should have been mine by right. The backs of their heads formed a wall between me and my father's casket. I straightened my spine, a reflex from years of military posture training, refusing to physically shrink despite how small I felt inside. "Hey," a voice whispered beside me. My cousin Melissa slid into the empty space, her eyes darting nervously toward the front where my mother sat ramrod straight beside my brother. "I saved you a seat." "I didn't think anyone should sit alone." I nodded my thanks, unable to trust my voice. Melissa leaned closer, her perfume momentarily masking the scent of lilies that filled the chapel. "I should warn you," she murmured. "Aunt Catherine told everyone you chose the army over blood. She's been saying it for weeks." The words stung, but they weren't surprising. 17 years of service, 4 deployments, and countless missed holidays had been distilled by my mother into a single narrative of betrayal. The organist began to play, the mournful notes filling the space as the ceremony commenced. From my position, I could see my brother's shoulders rise and fall with what appeared to be sobs. My mother patted his back, her other hand clutching a handkerchief, the perfect picture of a grieving family, minus one daughter. I remained dry-eyed, not because I felt nothing, but because years in combat zones had taught me to compartmentalize emotion. The weight of exclusion pressed against my chest, heavier than any rucksack I'd carried through desert terrain. As the chaplain began to speak about my father's life, I noticed how he carefully avoided mentioning my service, though he praised my father's patriotism. Another erasure, another small cut. The ceremony continued without me in my rightful place, the distance between the back row and the front a gulf too wide to cross. A collective intake of breath swept through the gathered mourners as the chapel doors opened. The unmistakable figure of a 4-star general appeared in the entryway, his chest adorned with rows of service medals that caught the light filtering through the stained glass windows. Every military person present instinctively straightened their posture, a reflexive response to such commanding presence. He was one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire army, a legend whose name inspired both awe and respect throughout the ranks. I recognized him immediately. During my 17 years of service, I had seen him at ceremonies and briefings, though always from a distance. His reputation for unwavering integrity preceded him everywhere. The general moved with deliberate purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he made his way down the center aisle. Everyone expected him to take a seat in the front, where distinguished guests were positioned. Instead, he continued past those rows, past my mother and brother, past distant relatives who had been given places of honor while I sat relegated to obscurity. His eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the room until they found me. Without hesitation, he approached my isolated position in the back row. The whispers grew louder as he settled into the empty space beside me. He offered no explanation, no words of condolence, just a respectful nod before facing forward. The weight of his silent solidarity hit me with unexpected force. Tears threatened to spill, not from grief this time, but from the profound validation of his gesture. This man, whose time was precious and whose presence was sought by politicians and military leaders alike, had chosen to sit with me, the outcast daughter. My mother turned in her seat, her face a mask of confusion and irritation, as she observed this unexpected development. My brother's eulogy notes trembled slightly in his hands. The temperature in the room had indeed changed, the chill of my isolation warming under the protective presence of military brotherhood. The general remained motionless beside me, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't need to speak. His actions communicated everything. In military culture, where symbolism and rank carried immense significance, his choice to sit beside me rather than in his rightful place of honor sent a clear message to everyone present. As the ceremony continued, I felt something shift inside me. The crushing weight of my mother's rejection eased slightly. I was not alone. I belonged to something larger than my broken family. In the silent solidarity of the general's presence, I found a different kind of belonging, one forged not in blood, but in service and sacrifice. The honor guard approached with the ceremonial triangle of blue and white stars, each fold representing something sacred about our nation. I watched from my isolated position as they moved with practiced precision, their white gloves a stark contrast against the deep navy fabric. This was the moment when a soldier's family receives the ultimate symbol of sacrifice and service, the flag that draped my father's casket. My heart raced as I prepared to accept this final connection to him. But before the lead officer could complete his solemn duty, my mother stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the hushed room. "Not her," she said, voice cutting through the reverent silence. "She abandoned this family. She doesn't deserve it." The honor guard froze, uncertainty flashing across their disciplined faces. The lead officer's eyes darted between my mother's rigid posture and my uniform, clearly torn between protocol and the family's wishes. Murmurs rippled through the gathering as relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Ma'am," the officer began carefully, "military protocol dictates—" "I don't care about your protocols," my mother interrupted, her voice trembling with 17 years of accumulated bitterness. "She chose the army over her blood, over her dying father." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. I remained motionless, the weight of public humiliation pressing down on my shoulders alongside the physical scars hidden beneath my uniform. This was worse than any battlefield. At least there, I understood the rules of engagement. Then I felt it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere as the general straightened beside me. He made no grand gesture, spoke no commanding words. He simply rose to his full height, stars gleaming on his shoulders, and fixed his gaze on the honor guard. His presence seemed to expand, filling the space with unspoken authority. The lead officer's posture changed immediately. With renewed certainty, he stepped around my mother, who stood frozen in disbelief as her control slipped away. The officer approached me directly, extended the precisely folded triangle, and delivered the ceremonial words with perfect clarity. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. As my fingers closed around the fabric, I felt the weight of what it represented, not just my father's service, but my own. The flag was warm, as if it still held something of my father's spirit. Through blurred vision, I caught the general's slight nod, not of sympathy, but of acknowledgement. In that moment, surrounded by family who rejected me, this simple triangle of fabric became my inheritance, my belonging, my right. The room fell silent as my brother approached the podium. He straightened his tie, a gesture I recognized from childhood when he wanted to appear important. Unlike me in my pressed uniform bearing the weight of 17 years of service, he had never ventured beyond Arlington's familiar streets. Yet here he stood, ready to speak for our father. As the one who stayed behind, he began, his voice carrying a practiced solemnity that seemed rehearsed in front of a mirror. I witnessed Dad's final years in a way others couldn't. His eyes flickered briefly in my direction, the implication hanging heavy in the air. I sat rigid beside the general, feeling the weight of every word as my brother continued his carefully crafted narrative. He spoke of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, moments captured in family photos where my absence was conspicuous. With each anecdote, he reinforced his position as the dutiful son, the one who had chosen family over duty. While some chose different paths, he said, pausing for effect, I remained by his side through doctor's appointments and late-night conversations. Several heads nodded in agreement. My mother's lips curved into a smile of approval as she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The retired neighbor who had earlier spoken to me shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze dropping to the floor. My brother continued weaving his tale of sacrifice and devotion, painting himself as the guardian of family tradition. Each word carefully erased my contributions, my letters home, my brief leave spent at our father's bedside. In his eulogy, I existed only as a shadow, the daughter who had chosen something else over family. Dad understood the value of presence, he said, his voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. He taught me that showing up matters more than anything else. I felt the general shift slightly beside me, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. His silent presence offered a counterpoint to my brother's narrative, a reminder that service carried its own form of showing up, its own kind of sacrifice. As my brother concluded with a quote about legacy and remembrance, I clutched the edge of the pew. The marble beneath my feet seemed to cool further, matching the chill spreading through my chest. His words had rewritten our shared history, positioning himself as the heir to our father's memory while relegating me to the margins. When he returned to his seat, the seat that should have been mine by tradition, the assembled mourners applauded softly. My mother reached for his hand, squeezing it with obvious pride. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about today's ceremony. This was about who would control the narrative of our family going forward. The folded flag in my lap felt suddenly heavier. The reception line had begun to thin as mourners drifted toward their vehicles, leaving behind the heavy silence that follows final goodbyes. I stood alone, clutching the folded flag that had nearly been denied to me, when I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. "Excuse me," a soft voice said. I turned to find Walter Jenkins, our retired neighbor from 3 houses down. His weathered face crinkled with kindness as he extended his hand. "Your father was so proud of you," he said, his voice barely audible above the rustling September leaves. "He used to stop by my porch almost every week with new stories about your deployments." My throat tightened. "He did?" The elderly man nodded, his eyes sincere beneath bushy white eyebrows. "Oh, yes. Richard would practically burst with pride telling me about your promotions, your medals. 'My daughter,' he'd say, 'is braver than I ever was.'" I blinked back tears, struggling to reconcile these words with the cold shoulder my family had given me today. Walter seemed to read my thoughts. "Your father wasn't always good at saying things directly," he continued, glancing toward my mother, who stood with my brother across the cemetery, pointedly ignoring my existence. "But to the rest of us, he never stopped talking about you." Walter described how my father had mapped my deployments on an old globe in his study, tracking my movements across continents with colored pins, how he'd clipped newspaper articles about military operations in regions where I was stationed, filing them carefully in leather binders. The day you received your Silver Star, he invited half the neighborhood over, brought out his good scotch, the one he saved for special occasions. I swallowed hard, picturing my father celebrating my achievements while I was thousands of miles away, unaware of his quiet pride. "He kept your letters in his desk drawer," Walter added. "Read them so often the paper started wearing thin at the folds." Around us, the cemetery grounds were emptying, but I stood rooted to the spot, absorbing these revelations like rain after drought. This simple conversation was rewriting everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my father. "I thought you should know," the neighbor said, squeezing my arm gently. "Whatever is happening today doesn't change how he felt." As Walter shuffled away toward his waiting daughter, I watched my mother's rigid back, her arm linked possessively through my brother's. Her whispered, "You're not family," still echoed in my ears, but somehow it had lost some of its power to wound. My father's pride, revealed through this unexpected messenger, offered a counterweight to her rejection, a reminder that family bonds exist beyond what is publicly acknowledged. The cardboard box felt heavier than its contents warranted as I carried it from my father's study. Evening shadows stretched across the hardwood floors of my childhood home, a place that no longer welcomed me. The house stood quiet, my mother and brother having retreated to receive condolences elsewhere, deliberately excluding me from their grief ritual. I sat cross-legged on the guest room floor, the same room I'd slept in during my brief leaves between deployments. My fingers trembled slightly as I sorted through the remnants of my father's life: old photographs, military medals from his own service, and financial documents neatly organized in manila folders. Then I found it, an envelope with my full name written in his distinctive handwriting, the letters slightly slanted to the right. The paper felt worn, as if he'd handled it many times before sealing it. Perhaps he'd written it years ago, adding to it over time, waiting for the right moment that never came. I broke the seal carefully, unfolding 3 pages of his thoughts. "My dearest daughter," it began, and those 3 words alone made my throat tighten. The letter continued with stories of how he'd followed my career from afar, collecting newspaper clippings about my unit's deployments, and how he discreetly contacted my commanding officers to check on my well-being. "I've never told you how proud I am," he wrote, "because your mother made it impossible. Her bitterness became the wall between us. But never doubt that I saw your courage. When you chose to serve, you honored our family's highest values, not abandoned them." Tears blurred my vision as I read his account of arguments with my mother over my service, battles fought in my absence and on my behalf. He described sitting alone in his study, tracing my likely location on maps during my deployments, praying for my safety, while pretending to my mother that he wasn't thinking of me. The final paragraph contained a confession. I asked General Matthews to watch over you if anything happened to me. He promised he would. Your mother may try to erase you from our family story, but remember, you are the best of what I hope to be. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling the weight of 17 years of misunderstanding lift slightly. The validation I'd sought for so long had been there all along, hidden behind my father's stoic exterior and my mother's wall of resentment. The folded flag rested on the nightstand beside me, its triangular shape catching the last light of day. I placed his letter beneath it, two symbols of honor, sacrifice, and a love that couldn't be spoken aloud until it was too late. The general's presence created ripples through the reception hall. Military personnel who had attended out of respect for my father noticed the four-star general's deliberate choice to stand beside me. One by one, without a word exchanged between them, officers in dress uniforms began to migrate in our direction. First came two captains I'd never met, positioning themselves casually nearby as if drawn by an invisible current. Then a lieutenant colonel nodded respectfully toward me before taking up position to my left. Within 15 minutes, I found myself at the center of an informal honor guard, not one I had requested, but one that had formed organically around the general's silent example. Your father spoke highly of your service record, murmured a silver-haired colonel who introduced himself as an old friend from my father's early days at West Point. His eyes reflected genuine respect, not pity. My mother noticed the shifting dynamics from across the room. I caught her glaring at the gathering of uniforms, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The narrative she had carefully constructed of the ungrateful daughter who abandoned family for military service was being visibly challenged by this display of solidarity. The retired neighbor who had spoken to me earlier approached our group, seemingly emboldened by the military presence. He shook hands with the general and exchanged pleasantries before turning to me. Your father kept a photograph of you in uniform on his desk, he said, loud enough for nearby mourners to hear. He never missed a chance to mention where you were deployed. The wall of respect around me wasn't just physical. It was reshaping the story being told in that room. Cousins who had earlier avoided eye contact now glanced over with uncertainty. My brother remained firmly by our mother's side, but I noticed his posture had stiffened, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. The general himself said nothing throughout this quiet transformation. He simply remained, his presence a statement that needed no verbal reinforcement. His silence carried more authority than any speech could have delivered. As the reception continued, I felt something shift inside me. The isolation that had threatened to swallow me whole just hours before had been replaced by something unexpected, a reminder that family extends beyond blood. The community I had found in service stood firm around me when my birth family would not. My mother might have tried to erase my place in the family narrative, but these officers, many of whom had never met me before today, were making it clear that I belonged to something larger, something that recognized sacrifice and honored commitment. In their silent solidarity, they reminded everyone in that room that I was not alone. The reception hall buzzed with hushed conversations as people balanced paper plates of untouched food and offered condolences with awkward embraces. I stood near a window, the folded flag clutched against my uniform, when my mother's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. "How dare you show up here and pretend to grieve?" she demanded, her voice rising with each word. The room fell silent as heads turned toward us. My mother's face was flushed with anger, her grief transmuted into rage directed squarely at me. She closed the distance between us with deliberate steps, her finger jabbing the air. 17 years! 17 years you abandoned this family for your precious army, and now you think you can just waltz back in and play the grieving daughter? I felt the eyes of everyone in the room, neighbors, distant relatives, my father's colleagues, all witnessing my public humiliation. The retired neighbor who had spoken kindly to me earlier lowered his gaze to the floor. My brother stood behind our mother, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and feigned concern. "You chose strangers over your own blood," she continued, her voice echoing against the walls. "You weren't here when he got sick. You weren't here when he needed his family. You have no right to stand here and claim his memory." My hands trembled around the carefully folded triangle of fabric. Each accusation landed like physical blows, reopening wounds that had never fully healed. The uniform I wore with such pride now felt like a target on my chest. "Your father waited for you," she said, her voice cracking slightly before hardening again. "He waited and you never came." Not until it was too late. The half-truth stung worst of all. My deployment had prevented me from returning when he first fell ill, a fact my mother had, twisted into willful abandonment. I had requested emergency leave as soon as I could, but by then, he was already gone. A few officers who had attended the funeral shifted uncomfortably near the door. The general remained seated, his posture rigid, but his eyes never leaving the confrontation. His presence was the only thing keeping me upright as my mother continued her tirade. "You're not family anymore," she declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You made your choice a long time ago. The army is your family now, not us." The words hung in the air, a public disownment delivered over funeral sandwiches and coffee. Some guests pretended to resume their conversations, while others watched with undisguised fascination at the family drama unfolding before them. I stood frozen, unable to defend myself against accusations that contained just enough truth to wound deeply, yet not enough to tell the whole story. The general's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. After hours of silent support, he finally spoke, his words measured but unmistakably firm. The four-star general stood tall, his decorated uniform commanding immediate attention, as everyone in the reception hall fell silent. "Mrs. Daniels," he addressed my mother directly, "your daughter has served this country with distinction through 3 combat deployments. She has led troops into battle and brought them home safely. She has earned every commendation on her uniform through blood and sacrifice." My mother's face flushed crimson as the high-ranking officer continued, his tone respectful but unyielding. The room had gone completely still, with even the servers pausing mid-step to listen. "I've known your husband for 20 years, he continued. He spoke of his daughter with immense pride. Her choice to serve wasn't a rejection of family. It was the highest expression of the values he instilled in her. I felt a lump forming in my throat as the general placed a steady hand on my shoulder. This gesture of solidarity from one of the Army's most respected leaders left me fighting back tears. "Your daughter belongs here today as much as anyone," he stated firmly. "She is both a soldier and your husband's child. Those identities are not in conflict. They are complementary parts of who she is." The whispers that had been circulating through the gathering died completely. Several of my father's old friends nodded in agreement, while my brother stared at his shoes, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "I didn't come here today as a courtesy," the general explained, his voice softening slightly. "I came because your husband asked me to stand with his daughter if this day ever came. He knew she might need someone in her corner." My mother's expression shifted from anger to shock. This revelation, that my father had anticipated her behavior and taken steps to shield me, seemed to strike her deeply. As the general finished speaking, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The shame that had been directed at me dissipated, replaced by a new understanding. Several guests who had earlier avoided eye contact now offered small smiles or nods of respect. The military leader didn't belabor his point. Having said what needed to be said, he returned to his quiet vigilance beside me. But his brief intervention had accomplished what hours of silence couldn't. It had validated my place in this gathering and in my father's life. For the first time since arriving in Arlington, I felt the weight of exclusion lifting from my shoulders. Though my mother remained rigid with resentment, the general's words had given me back my dignity in a room where it had been systematically stripped away. The morning after the funeral, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, the folded flag resting on my lap like a sacred artifact. My fingers traced the crisp edges of the triangle, each fold representing a piece of the country I had sworn to protect. The weight of it felt both comforting and accusatory. The house was silent. My mother had barely acknowledged my presence at breakfast, her eyes deliberately avoiding mine as she poured coffee for my brother. The contrast between the military honors I had received and the cold shoulder from my own family created a dissonance that echoed through every room. I unfolded my father's letter again, reading his words through tears. "I've always been proud of you," he had written in his steady hand. "Your courage to serve when others wouldn't is the greatest gift you could have given me." The paper was worn already from my repeated readings, as if I could absorb his posthumous approval through my fingertips. Outside my window, Arlington continued its rhythms. Neighbors walked their dogs, mail carriers delivered packages, and life moved forward with indifferent persistence. I wondered how many other homes in this military community housed similar wounds, divisions created by service and sacrifice. The general had called that morning to check on me. His gruff voice carried concern as he asked how I was holding up. "Your father would be proud of how you conducted yourself yesterday," he said. The validation helped, but couldn't heal the fracture that had been exposed for all to see. My brother passed my door without knocking, pausing only to say that Mother wanted me to return Dad's military memorabilia before I left. The request felt like another attempt to erase my connection to our father, to claim exclusive rights to his memory. I found myself questioning everything. Had my 17 years of service been a betrayal of family bonds? Or was it the purest expression of the values my father had instilled in me? The contradiction tore at me as I packed my uniform away. That afternoon, I walked through Arlington National Cemetery, seeking solace among the ordered rows of white markers. Each represented someone who had made choices similar to mine. I wondered how many of them had faced the same accusations of abandonment from those they loved most. The fractures in my family seemed beyond repair now. What the general's presence had temporarily shielded had only deepened in the aftermath. My mother's public rejection had crystallized something that had been forming for years. The understanding that sometimes honoring your values means losing your place at the family table. I touched my service ribbons, each representing moments when I had chosen duty over comfort. Perhaps that choice had always been leading to this moment of reckoning, this painful aftermath of humiliation and exclusion. Word spread through Arlington like wildfire. 3 weeks after my father's funeral, I noticed the subtle shift in how people looked at me when I ventured into town. Mrs. Calloway from 2 streets over stopped me outside the grocery store, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Your father spoke so highly of you," she said, squeezing my arm. "We all heard what happened at the service." It wasn't right. I nodded, unsure how to respond. The community grapevine had been working overtime, it seemed. Arlington was like that, a place where military tradition ran deep and respect for service was ingrained in the collective consciousness. My mother's public rejection had violated those unspoken codes. The following day, I received a handwritten note from my father's old colleague at the Pentagon. "Your service honors your father's memory," he wrote. Many of us were disturbed by what we witnessed. These small gestures accumulated like gentle rainfall. The barista at the coffee shop near the cemetery refused payment for my order. "On the house for our soldiers," she insisted with a knowing look. The owner of the bookstore downtown pulled me aside to share stories of my father stopping by, to proudly show photos of me in uniform. Even my father's attorney called, his voice careful but deliberate. "Your father made specific provisions for you," he said, despite what may have been implied at the service. The whispers worked both ways. I heard through a cousin that my mother was experiencing a subtle social cooling. Invitations to community functions had become less frequent. The ladies' auxiliary, where she'd held court for years, had questions about her treatment of a decorated soldier, her own daughter. This strange form of community justice wasn't something I'd sought, but it offered a balm to my wounded spirit. In Arlington, where military service was woven into the town's identity, my years of sacrifice carried weight beyond my family's walls. One evening, I encountered my former high school teacher at the Memorial Park. She walked beside me in silence for several minutes before speaking. "Communities have memories," she finally said. "Longer and more forgiving than families sometimes. Your place here isn't defined by your mother's words." I felt tears threatening to spill, but held them back. Outside my fractured family circle, I was finding unexpected allies. People who recognized my service not as abandonment, but as dedication. The retired neighbor who had spoken to me at the funeral invited me for dinner, introducing me to other veterans who welcomed me without question. In their company, I didn't have to explain or defend my choices. For the first time since returning to Arlington, I felt a tentative sense of belonging forming around me, not from blood, but from shared understanding. In the weeks following the funeral, my brother Thomas became increasingly vocal about his position in the family. Each time I visited our childhood home, he made sure to emphasize how he had always been there while I was deployed overseas. The living room walls, once adorned with photos of both of us, now prominently featured only his achievements: college graduation, local volunteer awards, and pictures with our parents at family gatherings I had missed while serving. "Dad always knew who he could count on," Thomas remarked one afternoon as I sorted through some of my father's belongings. He lingered in the doorway, arms crossed. "I was here every Sunday dinner for 15 years. Where were you?" The question hung in the air, rhetorical and sharp. We both knew exactly where I had been: Afghanistan, Iraq, military hospitals, and training grounds across the world. But in his narrative, my absence wasn't service. It was abandonment. Thomas had crafted his identity around being the child who stayed, the son who chose family over career. My mother reinforced this at every opportunity, introducing him to neighbors as the one who was always here for us. Their shared perspective created an impenetrable alliance that left no room for my explanation or experience. At a small family gathering the following weekend, I watched as Thomas positioned himself as the authority on our father's wishes regarding his workshop tools and memorabilia. "Dad would have wanted these to go to someone who will actually use them," he said pointedly. When I expressed interest in keeping our father's vintage compass collection, the rivalry wasn't just about possessions. It was about legitimacy. Thomas seemed determined to prove that physical presence trumped everything else, that my service to country somehow equated to betrayal of family. Each time I mentioned a memory of our father, he would counter with 3 more recent ones, as if we were competing in some macabre scorekeeping of paternal affection. What hurt most was recognizing that this competition hadn't started with our father's death. The seeds had been planted years earlier, watered by my mother's resentment and fertilized by my continued absence. Now, without our father's moderating presence, the divide between us grew into something that felt impossible to bridge. You can't just show up now and expect to be treated like family, Thomas told me bluntly one evening. Family is who shows up every day, not just for funerals. His words echoed our mother's sentiment at the funeral, creating another battlefield I hadn't been prepared to fight on. The division between us wasn't just emotional. It had become another front in the war between duty to country and loyalty to blood. My mother's resentment had calcified over the years into something unbreakable. In the weeks following my father's funeral, she continued her campaign against me, transforming her personal grievance into a community narrative. I learned from several Arlington neighbors that she had been sharing her version of events at the local community center, the grocery store, even after church services. She abandoned us, she would say, voice trembling with practiced emotion. 17 years in the army while her father needed her, while I needed her. The words stung even when relayed secondhand. Her bitterness had roots that stretched back to my enlistment day. I remembered her standing in our family kitchen, arms crossed, declaring that choosing service was choosing strangers over blood. What she never understood was that I had joined partly because of my father's quiet pride in military service, though he'd never had the opportunity himself. When I visited the family home to collect the remaining items my father had set aside for me, she watched from the doorway, a silent sentinel, ensuring I took nothing more than my allotted share. My brother hovered nearby, her loyal lieutenant in this cold war. "Your father was heartbroken every deployment," she said as I carefully placed a few photographs into a cardboard box. "He just never showed you because he didn't want to make you feel guilty." I knew this wasn't true. The letter in my pocket proved otherwise. But her need to control the family narrative was so powerful that I suspected she had convinced even herself of these falsehoods. At one point, she produced a photo album I'd never seen before. "Look," she said, flipping through pages of family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, all from the years I'd been deployed. "We had to become a family of two because you chose to leave." Each image was carefully curated evidence in her case against me. What remained unspoken was how she had discouraged me from coming home on leave, claiming it would disrupt their routine, how my calls often went unanswered. The homemaker, who had once packed my school lunches with notes of encouragement, now worked tirelessly to excise me from our family history. My brother, emboldened by her approval, had begun referring to himself as the only child in certain circles. As I left that day, carrying the small box of memories, I realized her resentment wasn't just about my absence. It was about my independence, my refusal to live by her narrow definition of family loyalty. In her mind, I hadn't just chosen the army over them. I had rejected her authority, her vision of who I should be. And that, perhaps, was the one betrayal she could never forgive. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a message on my smartphone. The four-star general wanted to meet at a small restaurant near Arlington National Cemetery. I arrived early, my hands trembling slightly as I waited. When General Robert Harrison entered, heads turned. Even in civilian clothes, his commanding presence was unmistakable. He nodded politely to the waitstaff before sitting across from me. "I owe you an explanation," he said after ordering coffee. His eyes, weathered by decades of service and leadership, held mine steadily. "Your father and I served together briefly in our early years. We weren't close friends, but we maintained contact." I listened, confused about why someone of his stature would maintain such a connection with my father, who had been a respectable but not high-ranking officer. "3 years ago, your father contacted me out of the blue," the general continued. He was already sick then, though few people knew. He asked to meet privately. My throat tightened. Dad had hidden his illness from me during our video calls, always insisting he was just tired when I noticed his pallor. Your father knew exactly how your mother would react when he passed, Harrison said, his voice softening. He understood the dynamics of your family better than anyone. He made me promise that when the time came, I would be there for you. I stared at my untouched water glass, fighting tears. He said, my daughter serves with honor, but her mother will never forgive her for choosing duty over family. When I'm gone, she'll need someone to stand beside her. The general's voice remained steady, but I could hear the respect in it. I gave him my word. The realization that my father had anticipated my mother's cruelty, had known I would need protection even at his own funeral, was both heartbreaking and deeply comforting. He was immensely proud of you, Harrison continued. He kept track of your deployments, your promotions. He collected newspaper clippings when your unit was mentioned. A tear escaped despite my efforts. The general pretended not to notice, giving me a moment to compose myself. Your father understood sacrifice, he said finally, both the kind made on battlefields and the kind made in families. He wanted you to know that your choice to serve was honored by him, even if others couldn't see its value. I nodded, unable to speak. I intend to keep my promise to your father, the general said. Not just at his funeral, but going forward. You're not alone in this, Captain. For the first time since returning to Arlington, I felt the weight on my shoulders lighten, just a little. The flag rested on my lap as I sat alone in my apartment, its triangular form heavier than its physical weight suggested. I traced my fingers over the crisp edges, remembering how close I had come to losing the sacred piece of my father. The blue field of stars seemed to shimmer in the dim light, each one representing something different now. Not just states in a union, but moments lost with my father while I served overseas. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, yet I could still hear my mother's voice cutting through the cemetery air, insisting I had no right to this symbol of honor. The honor guard's hesitation played on repeat in my mind, their uncertain glances, the uncomfortable shifting of weight from one foot to another. If not for the general's presence, this flag would now be displayed in my mother's living room, where I was no longer welcome. When I held the flag, I felt closest to my father. It was as if his spirit resided within the carefully folded fabric, a tangible connection to the man who had secretly championed me while I was deployed. Sometimes I would unfold it slightly, just enough to see the red stripes, before carefully returning it to its triangular form, a ritual that brought both comfort and pain. The victory of receiving what was rightfully mine came with consequences I hadn't fully anticipated. My brother had stopped taking my calls entirely. Extended family members chose sides, most aligning with my mother's narrative of abandonment. Holiday invitations disappeared. Family photos were shared in group messages that excluded me. The fracture had spread beyond my immediate family, creating a chasm I wasn't sure could ever be bridged. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake questioning everything: my decision to enlist, my choice to redeploy multiple times, my absence during my father's decline. The flag sat on my bedside table, both accusation and validation. Had I traded one family for another? Was my service worth the cost of belonging? Yet when doubt threatened to overwhelm me, I would remember the general sitting beside me, his silent presence a shield against my mother's contempt. I would recall my father's letter, hidden now in my dresser drawer, its words of pride a balm against rejection. The flag represented everything complicated about service and sacrifice, honor and loss, duty and absence, recognition and rejection. It was both trophy and burden, a symbol of what I had earned and what I had lost. As I carefully placed it back in its display case, I wondered if I would ever find a way to carry both my identity as a soldier and my place as a daughter without feeling torn between worlds. Winter descended on Arlington with a biting chill that matched the coldness I felt from my family. The holidays arrived, bringing with them a flurry of invitations that never found their way to my mailbox. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned of Thanksgiving dinner at my mother's house, Christmas Eve celebrations, and even my niece's birthday party, all family gatherings that proceeded without me. My brother posted photos online, carefully curated family moments that told a story of wholeness despite my absence. In each image, my mother beamed beside him, her arm draped around his shoulder, the dutiful son who had never left. The empty space, where I should have stood, was filled with cousins, friends, and neighbors, as if the family had simply closed ranks and erased the gap. I spent those months in a small apartment near the base, the folded flag from my father's funeral displayed in a case on my mantel. Beside it sat his letter, now framed, its edges softened from repeated readings. On the darkest nights, I would trace his handwriting with my fingertips, finding comfort in the knowledge that he had been proud of me, even if he couldn't say it aloud. The general called occasionally, his gruff voice a reminder that I belong somewhere, even if not with those who shared my blood. "Your father would be proud of how you're handling this," he said during one call, the weight of his words carrying me through another week of silence from my mother's house. Arlington's military community embraced me in ways my family wouldn't. Fellow officers invited me to their homes for meals. Veterans nodded respectfully when they spotted me in uniform around town. The retired neighbor who had spoken to me at the funeral invited me for coffee regularly, sharing stories of my father that my mother had tried to keep from me. "Your dad used to stand a little taller whenever someone asked about you," he told me one afternoon, steam rising from his mug. "He kept a map in his study with pins marking everywhere you'd been deployed." "Didn't tell your mother, of course." These small kindnesses sustained me through the isolation. I threw myself into my work, volunteering for additional responsibilities and training exercises that filled the empty weekends when family memories threatened to overwhelm me. The folded flag and my father's letter became talismans of sorts, physical proof that I belonged to something larger than my mother's narrow definition of family. The general's quiet act of sitting beside me that day had rippled outward, creating a different kind of belonging that, while not replacing what I had lost, offered its own form of solace. 8 months after my father's funeral, Arlington National Cemetery bloomed with spring flowers, a stark contrast to the gray autumn day when we had laid him to rest. The commemorative ceremony organized by my father's former colleagues gathered under a cloudless sky, with cherry blossoms framing the solemn yet celebratory atmosphere. I arrived in my dress uniform, medals catching the sunlight as I walked among the marble headstones. Unlike the funeral, today I was not relegated to the shadows. My name appeared prominently on the program, listed as both daughter and soldier. My service record acknowledged alongside my father's legacy. The retired neighbor who had spoken to me at the funeral approached with a warm smile. "Your father would be proud of this," he said, gesturing to the gathering crowd. Veterans, community members, and military personnel mingled together, creating a tapestry of respect that had been absent during those painful funeral moments. Then I saw her. My mother stood at the edge of the gathering, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. She wore black, as if still in mourning, but her presence itself was unexpected. My brother was noticeably absent. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors. As the flag unfurled in the spring breeze, I felt the weight of my own folded flag at home, the one I had nearly been denied. Today, there would be no such struggle. When the general arrived, heads turned in respect. He nodded to me with quiet acknowledgement before taking his place at the podium. His speech was measured and powerful, weaving together my father's dedication to country with my own continued service. 2 generations, he said, bound by duty and honor. Throughout the ceremony, I caught my mother watching me. For the first time, she was witnessing others celebrate what she had tried to erase, my legitimate place in my father's legacy. The community's respect formed a shield around me that even her coldness couldn't penetrate. After the formal proceedings, community members approached to share memories of my father, many including stories he had told about me during my deployments. Each anecdote was another thread reconnecting me to him, despite my mother's attempts to sever those bonds. My mother remained until the end, silent and observing. She never approached me directly, but her presence acknowledged what she couldn't bring herself to say, that I belonged here, that I was part of this story whether she approved or not. As the ceremony concluded and people dispersed into the spring afternoon, I realized that while blood might define family in one sense, there are other kinds of belonging that can be equally powerful. Bonds forged through service, respect, and shared values that transcend even the deepest family fractures. The spring sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as the commemorative ceremony drew to a close. 8 months had passed since I'd stood in this same place, relegated to the back row at my own father's funeral. Now, surrounded by a community that recognized my sacrifice, everything felt different. I stood tall in my uniform, the weight of 17 years of service evident in my posture. To my right, the 4-star general who had changed everything with his silent solidarity that September day. To my left, fellow soldiers who had traveled to stand with me. Their presence formed a protective circle that no family rejection could penetrate. My mother sat in the front row, her back rigid with lingering resentment. She hadn't wanted to attend, but the community pressure had been too great to ignore. Throughout the ceremony, I caught her watching me from the corner of her eye, perhaps seeing for the first time how others valued what she had dismissed. When they called me forward to receive a memorial plaque honoring both my father's memory and my continued service, the applause was thunderous. The retired neighbor who had first told me of my father's private pride wiped tears from his eyes. Even my brother, seated awkwardly beside our mother, offered a hesitant nod. "Your father would be proud," the general whispered as I returned to my place. His words weren't necessary anymore. I knew the truth now, but they wrapped around me like armor nonetheless. As people dispersed, forming small groups across the cemetery grounds, I noticed my mother standing alone. The narrative she had constructed of the abandoned wife, the betrayed parent, had crumbled in the face of this public recognition. Her power to define my place in the family had diminished with each handshake and word of respect directed my way. I fingered the folded flag I'd brought with me, the one she had tried to deny me. It represented not just my father now, but the family I had found beyond blood, people who understood that duty and love weren't opposing forces. Walking among the marble headstones afterward, I realized that belonging isn't always given. Sometimes it must be earned or even created. My place in this world wasn't defined by my mother's bitter whispers or my brother's competitive posturing, but by the choices I'd made and the people who recognized their value. The cemetery quieted as evening approached. I placed my hand on my father's headstone, feeling the connection that transcended both death and family discord. In the end, I had honored him in the way that mattered most, by living with the courage he had always seen in me, even when I couldn't see it myself.